was like a 5-year-old going to Hulk Hogan. That's just how big this man was.
For all you kids watching at home, Santa just is white.
Michelle Obama saying that museums are for white people.
Stopping black people more than white people.
We're not executing people for crimes, but for violating the racial hierarchy.
The GI Bill had been earmarked for white veterans only.
All we've done is cut straight.
Religion, which was infused with the idea of race. And there's several biblical stories, Ham and his father, Noah and 3 sons, and Hagar, who was a house servant of Abraham and Sarah, that she was supposed to be black because she went to bed with another man's wife, and nobody would do that but a whore. And in my grandmother's generation, that's what they called her generation too, Aunt Hagar's children. They were the children, the descendants of this Hagar woman, this obviously black, you make race retroactive, so fit. So Hagar must have been black, because if she was a white woman, she wouldn't have sinned like that.
Another way that I think white privilege manifests itself, going back to this idea of media and images, is through religion. That even Jesus, who really should not look European, white, does in almost all of that imagery. So once again, even as religion is our country is grounded in religion itself, that's another place where that whole privilege has been experienced. That, and I think for many people it is shocking if they see an image of Jesus that is not white.
So I would argue that within Christianity there's a real problem in terms of Jesus being identified as having blonde hair and blue eyes. We know that the region of the world in which he grew up and which he was born, the folks don't look like that from that particular part of the world. And so we have here in the United States an adoption of a mostly blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus. And that image of Jesus plays a huge role in terms of how people in the faith community connect to Christianity. So for example, if Jesus had dark hair, if he had dark eyes, if he had dark skin, would the majority of people who identify as Christian continue to do so? That's a real question. I would argue that that's a manifestation of white supremacy, placing Jesus in an image that is palatable to white people.
So the psychological impact of a kind of worshiping a white Jesus is that, it goes back to those kind of subconscious messages that are kind of fed to us. So if your subconscious image is of, your Lord and your Savior being someone who doesn't look like you, kind of the message that it reinforces is one of subservience and one of lack of agency. So there's this white Jesus out there that's going to save me, but I don't really have the agency within myself to be able to save myself.
We buried white Jesus in a casket. That was a ceremonial thing, and it was covered by one of these local radio channels, one of those educational channels. Forget that. That's nonsense. For you to believe that the Lord God Almighty, the creator of the world and all that, it turned out to look like an Englishman or some German or something like that. We aren't there yet. That's a part of our fear too. I'm talking about fear, because I don't mess with black ministers. I love them. I think I do. It's fine. And I raised that one some time ago. Why is the white Jesus on the wall? We need to take it down. And this particular minister, he's gone now. he's ready to duke up, over. What do you mean, And I said, well, he's white, I said, he said, well, what difference does it make what color he is? I said, fine, that's what I'm talking about. Why ain't he black, You can make him black, it doesn't matter. He doesn't have to be a white man. That's saying something there about the doctrine of white supremacy. That black people defend that without thinking. Jesus wasn't, if he couldn't have been a white man, not the white man and behave that way towards you, that's impossible.
Mama, couldn't we at least let black Jesus hang alongside?
Forget it. The only Jesus I know is him, and the one thing he don't need is a partner. This picture has been in my family for as long as I can remember. When I was a baby, I don't know what I saw first. My mama, my papa, or this Jesus. Now, he's the one I know and love, so let's close the subject.
Because if your, reference point for goodness, for purity, is someone who, really doesn't look like you, then it does become a lot more difficult to really recognize the divinity that's present within, yourself and within all of us as human beings.
Religion can be used to foster white supremacy. So if you look at the images of Jesus or, the white hands of God, that sort of thing, if you have the idea as a, person of a given racial group in a society, a highly racialized society like our own, if you think that God is white or the Savior is white, that leads to certain perceptions that whites are superior to your own, racial or ethnic group.
Even in a black church, you will see a white Jesus. So I think that there's certainly I think not only has there been only certain ideologies or certain images that are being touted, but I think that cultural communities have in some ways adopted those images as the only images. So for me, that gets at internalized oppression and the impact of white supremacy on people of color.
Almost universally, our stories dealing with divinity, the supernatural, fantasy, and otherworldly constructs reflect whiteness. Not only Jesus and the God of the Bible, but the angels are also white. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is white. When in human form, the devil is white, except when he looks like President Obama. The apostles are white, except Judas, who in Jesus Christ Superstar was black. Abstractions such as Father Time, Baby New Year, the Four Winds, the Tooth Fairy, they're all white. Most of us have heard of the Greek gods, such as Zeus and Hercules, but few know of the gods of people of color, such as the Orisha from West African culture. And of course, Santa is white. But this is what St. Nicholas of Myra actually looks like. Also in the realm of fantasy, such as Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or anything to do with elves and dwarves or wizards, that's pretty much an all-white affair. Even in so-called progressive shows such as Star Trek, we find mostly white people flying around the universe to only encounter what? Other white-like people. So essentially, white supremacy is reflected universally when it comes to visual images and is the context for almost everything divine or fantastical. The message is basically that whites rule this world and the next. Politics is the mechanism that allocates resources among the citizens of the country. The House of Representatives is 80% white males, and the Senate is 94% white males. But white males only make up 31% of the US population. So you have the dominant group that has always been in power in this country deciding who gets what and how much. It stands to reason that, almost reflexively, this majority of white males will make sure their political decisions benefit the people they implicitly and explicitly have been taught are the real citizens. And that's white America.
Well, I would argue that there's been a divide and conquer strategy that's been in place for a very long time. And it's a way of using race and color to divide people who really would have common interests if they were able to put race on a shelf or not pay as close attention to the fact that we are different on the outside or may have different cultural beliefs and ways of doing things. And so oftentimes what you see happening is that the political system is used to perpetuate difference on the basis of race and socioeconomics. There has been an intentional smear campaign against poor African Americans. And it has to do with the fact that you have African Americans who may disproportionately rely upon the public welfare system in order to be able to put food on the table. Rather than peeling back the layers and understanding that this has more to do with a lack of economic justice and a lack of economic opportunity, and the fact that from one generation to the next, we have faced poverty at disproportionate rates. People like to hone in on the fact that that African Americans have to rely upon these systems and say that it's based on laziness or it's based on genetics or it's based on not working as hard. And we know that those are all lies that people tell. And the reality is that the majority of people who receive public benefits are actually white folks, you know, who have also faced historical inequities on the basis of socioeconomics. But the fact that some politicians have used race as a way of explaining why African Americans disproportionately rely upon the public welfare system, people tend to believe that rhetoric and they demonize African Americans and other people of color. They don't tend to recognize the fact that during the days of slavery and in the aftermath of slavery, you had a population of people that had faced subjugation and discrimination from one generation to the next, suddenly unleashed upon the general public without access to resources, never having received the 40 acres and a mule that they were promised, and being forced to fend for themselves in a land that was hostile to their very existence. I mean, even President Lincoln wanted to send slaves back to Africa. And so we have to understand that context plays a huge role in who is on the top and who is on the bottom in our society. We've never remedied those issues. And instead of recognizing that the playing field has never been leveled, that many folks who are descendants of slaves have never had equal access to opportunity, we blame them when they need resources to survive.
Distorting welfare abuse is just one part of a larger political strategy to blame blacks for the ills of society, thus prompting whites to vote for politicians who vow to take care of the black problem once elected. President Lyndon Baines Johnson once said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." Just like the indentured servants that were pitted against black slaves, savvy political operatives continue to advise politicians to use race to convince whites to vote against their best interest in a bid to wrestle power and resources from competing blacks and other minorities. They even have a name for it. It's called the Southern Strategy, and Republicans and Democrats both roll out political versions of this divide and conquer tactic.
You know, numerous historians and political scientists have documented now that the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough political appeals on issues of crime and welfare in order to appeal to poor and working class white voters who were resentful of, anxious about, fearful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Pollsters and political strategists found that these thinly veiled promises to get tough on a group of people, not so subtly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. So the war on drugs was really an effort by the Reagan administration plan to make good on campaign promises, to get tough on a group of people defined largely by race.
You handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
It's time to change our approach. It's time to end the era of mass incarceration.
But the thing is, Hillary was a pretty vocal supporter of mass incarceration when it was introduced by then-President Bill Clinton during the 90s. In 1994, he signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. It gave us tougher sentences, more prisons, more cops in the streets, and the federal 3 strikes provision. That meant that if you were charged with a violent crime 3 times, you were off to prison for life, even if those crimes were relatively minor. Those policies, designed to help the Democrats look tough on crime, have led to a massive rise in the U.S. prison population over the last 2 decades. Almost 7 million Americans are locked up on probation or on parole, and minorities are disproportionately targeted. They make up 60% of the prison population, with 1 in 3 black men likely to be in prison at some point in their lives.
One of the things that happened during the 1960s was that the Voting Rights Act was put into place as a way of remedying some of the issues that African Americans face when we went to vote. And in recent years, we've seen the Supreme Court gut certain provisions within the Voting Rights Act. So there was a pre-clearance requirement in which certain jurisdictions that had a legacy and a history of discriminating against African Americans at the voting booths would actually have to demonstrate that that they were complying with the law, that they were allowing equal access to the voting booths. And so recently, the Supreme Court actually gutted some of those provisions of the Voting Rights Act, saying that many of those jurisdictions no longer had to be under federal monitoring to show that they were following the law. And we know that as a result of the Supreme Court's decision, that some of those states are back to their old tricks again in terms of putting up structural and systemic barriers to make it more difficult for people of color to be able to vote and to make sure that they're getting equal opportunity to go to the voting booths and to cast their ballots for whichever candidate they decide that they want to vote for.
Voter suppression speaks to that directly. So you don't want Hispanics to vote, you don't want blacks to vote. You know, we talked about the criminal justice system before, so if you have a record, you're disenfranchised. So, you know, if you can shrink that, voting population, that's going to help to, keep that white advantage in place.
One of the things that has happened in the political process since 1965 is the ongoing attempt by the conservative wing of America to dismantle all of the civil rights bills that were passed in the 1960s. Voting rights has been attempted to be taken apart and put back together again to reflect this country in the name of what voting rights were in the 1950s.
These attacks on voting rights started right after President Obama won.
Barber and the NAACP believe photo voter ID laws in North Carolina and more than a dozen other states suppress minority voter turnout because Black and Latino voters are the most likely to lack an acceptable photo ID or the documents to get one.
The Republican strategy to disenfranchise their political opponents has reached a whole new phase in Alabama, and this time the racism driving it has been laid bare for all to see. Due to budget cuts, Alabama law enforcement agency said that 31 satellite DMV offices would no longer have access to driver's license examiners meaning that residents will need to travel to other counties to apply for licenses. And it's important to note that this move comes just 1 year after the state's voter photo ID law went into effect. So we're going to require you to have a photo ID given by the state to be able to take part in our democratic process. Oh, but by the way, you can't get it in your county, and not if you're a certain type of person, especially because there's an incredibly racial, motive that is driving this. Take a look at the 10 Alabama counties with the highest percentage of non-white registered voters, and he lists those counties. Thanks to its budgetary insanity and inanity, just opted to close driver license bureaus in 8 of them. 8 of the 10 highest percentage of non-white registered voters. In fact, every single county in which blacks make up more than 75% of registered voters will see their driver license office closed. Every one.
The answer to the question, is the civil rights movement over in the political process? No, and it will never be over, because there will always be those people who are trying to take America back, to make America America again at the expense of the life and the liberties of African Americans.
Our politicians are all talk, no action. Millions of people are flowing across our southern border. We've got to build a real wall. With all of this, our country has tremendous potential. Let's make America great again.
Donald Trump, a man who is the poster child, if you will, of the success of what white dominance can offer. What candidate Trump brings to the table is a rendition of someone who can bring America back to that segregated mentality and segregated ideology without using the word segregation.
I do believe that what Donald Trump has been saying does tap into white fear, that fear, and white fear being that idea of losing power or losing ground.
So I think a lot of whites in our society are very afraid that whites, at some point in the not too distant future will be a demographic minority in our country. So, if you put together Asians, blacks, and Hispanics, we're going to, make up a larger proportion of the population and the electorate than whites. And I think a lot of whites are very afraid of that. I think that speaks to the interesting popularity of candidates like Donald Trump, which a lot of people said would not have a chance to be elected president. But he's appealing to that afraid, largely working class, white, Republican, ultra-conservative wing of the party. And, that speaks to his popularity in these primaries. But, it's that fear. So, he's going to send the immigrants back. He's going to take our country back, whatever that means. His attacks on President Obama, his citizenship, and, credibility, I think speak to this proportion of the white population that's very afraid of what's going to happen when whites are no longer the, political majority in our society.
Why are you supporting Trump?
Because he's the one that's going to save our country, turn things around.
They exploited and manipulated a preconceived plan of ethnic cleansing and political repression against us that had been brewing for years.
They're trying to ethnically cleanse white people?
Well, sure they are. Won't you wake up?
He knows what needs to be done.
What needs to be done?
Well, like he said, make America great again. In Dixieland, I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie.
At this point in the 21st century, racism, white dominance is a moral issue. And that moral issue still views black people as less than white people. This is where law enforcement takes our lives tenfold compared to white people committing the same crime.
So when you think about, police officers in present day sort of over-responding to what's kind of considered to be non-compliant black people, you can certainly trace a link to, slave days, So when, slave masters needed to assert, dominance or authority over their slaves, slaves who were considered uppity or unruly were often sort of violently punished, viciously punished, often in front of the other slaves in order to really, establish that dominance. So when we look at law enforcement today, I mean, it is really sort of a kind of establishing dominance when these officers overreact in these ways. But I also think that there's also an element of fear in these overreactions. So when you go back to those sort of kind of tropes about African American men being somehow superhuman or somehow being overpowering, a lot of times when these officers are faced with African American people, they completely overreact because they have this fear somehow that black men are going to somehow viciously overtake them and overpower them with their bare hands, even though they're carrying lethal weapons.
In recent times, we have seen thousands of people who have been killed, particularly unarmed African Americans that have been killed at the hands of police. The reality is that the federal government does not require documentation of people who have been killed by police. That's part of the problem. Because we have never reconciled the racial issues in this country, we know that race continues to be a factor in terms of who winds up beaten or killed by police. And when you see unarmed African Americans being killed by police, it does remind us of what happened during the lynching era, because again, you're seeing people killed on video, you're seeing witnesses present, but you're still seeing a lack of accountability under the law for those officers who have killed folks who have been unarmed. And it's very painful, and it reminds us of what has happened historically, where there seems to be vigilante justice or extrajudicial killings of black folks, and there's very little to no accountability. It sends a message that state-sanctioned violence against African Americans will continue to be allowed.
The Klan does not nearly have the power and the presence that they formerly had. You could associate with the Klan. They could get away with it. They had congressmen and state legislatures and all of it. The Klan was a very powerful political force. They're gone now. The civil rights movement has pushed them mainly to the side. Now it's the policeman's job. The guy whose cousins is in the Klan, and he was last year till he became a policeman.
Well, 2 Florida police officers are out of a job after an FBI report tied them to the Ku Klux Klan. That's right, Fruitland Park Deputy Chief David Borst resigned, and Officer George Honeywell was fired last week, according to the city manager. The link between the KKK and these guys surfaced in a report from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement based on information from the FBI.
Charleston Police Lieutenant Sean Williams' mission has always been to crack down on crime and clean up the city.
I'd like to think we've done a pretty good job of keeping the riffraff out of here.
Head of the department's patrol unit, the 16-year veteran is now off the streets and under investigation after sources confirmed to 13 News a video containing racially insensitive material has surfaced. The video in question has not been publicly released, but those close to the investigation tell us Williams' young daughter is wearing parts of a CPD uniform dancing to a Ku Klux Klan song as a man's voice presumed to be Williams shouts racial slurs.
San Francisco Police Department is under fire after a startling investigation revealed racist and homophobic text messages sent by police officers. Messages like this one reading "white power," or this one that says "get your pocket gun, keep it available in case the monkey returns to its roots." It's not against the law to put an animal down.
You ever try to find a bruise on a nigger? Freaks out, huh? It's not like you're really listening to their words, because you'll key on what's the truth and what isn't. First thing, anything out of a nigger's mouth for the first 5 or 6 sentences is a fucking lie. Fight or fuck around with the police, but you do what you're told. You understand, Dick? Sometimes to a trooper. And you know which gang did it, but they weren't taught. If I can pick up 3 or 4 gangs and bring them to the station, take one in the basement, just beat the dog shit out of it, not even ask them a question, bring them up to sitting down. Bleed, basements are all popped up, got hurt. Next guy, take him downstairs. Okay, good shot at him. Where else, Johnny? That's how you get information. Leave that old station, and it's got the smell of niggers that have been beaten and killed in there for years.
Next, US police are embroiled in yet another controversy after getting caught this time using mugshots of black suspects for target practice. It happened recently in North Miami, prompting accusations of racism.
Black Americans are used to cops in their neighborhoods intimidating them and discriminating against them. I know to some that seems like, oh, that's crazy. That couldn't possibly be true. Well, they're going to be interested to find out about some Fort Lauderdale cops who were found to be significantly racist, as you're about to see. NBC Miami reports the officers reportedly sent a trailer-style video amongst themselves containing a Ku Klux Klan hood, attacks against minorities, derogatory images of President Obama, and racist comments about Hispanics and homosexuals. Here, watch for yourself.
There is a bit of a connection between lynching and disproportionate killing of African Americans in law enforcement. When you think about lynching, the kind of reason for lynching was really to, number one was to sort of instill fear and terror into the hearts of African American people. Another reason for lynching was, fear. So fear that the dominant structure was somehow being usurped by, Black people asserting their freedoms and Black people, gaining, economic gains and political gains, financial gains. So when the KKK sort of sprang up, it was really sort of around the same time as the Reconstruction. So we know that during Reconstruction days, Black people had sort of unparalleled gains in politics and economics and within education. So a lot of the Black universities in the South were established by freed slaves, and kind of after this sort of post-Reconstruction era, that all sort of got dismantled. So when you think about, this disproportionate killing of Blacks, in present day, I think it also is an assertion of, fear that somehow Black people are taking something away from the dominant society just by, existing.
One of the most startling examples of racism comes to mind when I think about what happened to 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. For those who are unfamiliar with that story, Tamir Rice was basically playing outside of a park in Cleveland, and he had an air gun in his hands. Someone called the police, and they said, there's a kid playing with the gun. We think that it's a toy gun. And officers arrived on the scene. They did not ask any questions. Within seconds, they fired shots at Tamir Rice and they killed him. Again, this is a 12-year-old Black boy who was killed. The reality is that the officers did not even call for emergency assistance after they shot Tamir Rice. Apparently, an FBI agent was walking by, saw Tamir Rice lying there, and then questioned the officers about why they had not called for emergency medical assistance for Tamir Rice. And it was that FBI agent that was the reason why medical attention was even rendered to Tamir Rice. Now, the reality is that after Tamir Rice was shot, his sister, who was 14 years old at the time, ran to his aid. And we see on video officers actually tackling Tamir Rice's sister, handcuffing her and placing her in the back of a squad car. I cannot imagine the trauma that that child must have faced in seeing her brother gunned down and then being tackled by officers and treated like a criminal while trying to render aid to her baby brother. And then when Tamir Rice's mother came on the scene, she was given a choice of whether to ride in the back of the ambulance with Tamir Rice or whether to ride in the back of a squad car with her daughter. No mom should have to be put in that situation. And it shows the fact that we are still not seen as human in this country, that our humanity is constantly being denied in terms of how we're treated. And I heard Tamir Rice's mom speak in Washington, D.C. within the last year, and she talked about the fact that her baby is gone and that she wants to see justice for her child. Now, most of us who've been following the case thought for sure that officers would be held accountable under the law, particularly the officer who shot Tamir Rice because of his troubled history and the fact that he's had trouble with at least one other police department based on some of his actions. But the investigations came back saying that the shooting of Tamir Rice was actually justified. And I wonder, as an attorney, as a law professor, how it is possible for us as an American society to witness the death of a 12-year-old child at the hands of police and to say that it was okay for something like this to happen. It shows that our system is deeply flawed, that there are still major problems within our system, and that we still continue to undervalue the lives of African American men, women, and children.
There's another female when I say he's a police officer. I said, man, why did you shoot me for? He said, oh man, I thought you had a weapon. I thought your phone was a weapon. I said, how the you think my phone was a weapon? If I'm on the phone, why did you shoot me?
Shot by an off-duty Chicago cop, a man is hurt, his friend killed.
22-year-old Rekia Boyd was shot in the head. She hung on in critical condition, but was pronounced dead today at Mount Sinai Hospital.
We want to also talk about Rekia Boyd today, 22 years old, when she was shot and killed in 2012 by an off-duty Chicago police detective. Dante Servin fired several shots over his shoulder into a group of people Rekia was standing with near his home, striking her in the back of her head. Servin claims he thought a man with the group had a gun, but no gun was ever found. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter, marking the first time in 15 years a Chicago police officer was charged for a fatal shooting. But last month, in a dramatic dismissal, Judge Dennis Porter acquitted Servin on a legal fine point.
Simply put, the evidence presented in this case does not support the charges on which the defendant was indicted and tried. The motion for a directed finding is granted. There is a finding of not guilty on all counts, and the defendant is discharged.
A group of protesters hit the streets tonight, marching against Cook County Judge Dennis Porter's decision today. Chicago police detective Dante Servin walked out of court a free man.
The motion for a directed finding is granted. There is a finding of not guilty on all counts, and the defendant is discharged.
Servin, talking to cameras after the decision, maintained his innocence.
Any police officer especially would have reacted in the exact same manner that I reacted, and I'm glad to be alive. I saved my life that night.
A Chicago police officer was found not guilty this week in the off-duty shooting of 22-year-old Rekia Boyd in 2012. But wait until you find out why he was found not guilty. Now, the details of the actual shooting are a little bit sketchy. We do know that he was off-duty, that he was in his vehicle shooting over his shoulder at a group of teens having some sort of confrontation in an alleyway. When he thought he saw a gun being held, it was in fact actually a cell phone. And he fired and killed Rekia Boyd. Now, the judge has found him not guilty. Now, listen to this explanation of why. The act of intentionally firing a gun at some person or persons on the street is an act that is so dangerous it is beyond reckless. It is intentional, and the crime, if any there be, is first-degree murder. So the fact that he was charged with involuntary manslaughter, it was not a strong enough charge So he's now been found not guilty, and thanks to the rules on double jeopardy we have, he might well escape any sort of actual criminal penalties simply because they went too light with their initial charge.
If you're gonna give me a ticket for no seatbelt, right here, then just give me a ticket so I can go to the hospital, because the doctor called me to tell me to come in because my mom is about to pass away. All right, so I guess he's looking for his information in his book bag. When he digs in his book bag, they pulls a gun out. What was the purpose of a gun? And now they asking me to open my door so I can get out. I'm scared. If you can pull out a gun in front of it's two kids in the back seat. If you understand? Yes. All right. No, don't mess now they about to mess no!
I'm not the operator of this vehicle. So if you do that, all right. I'm not the operation of this vehicle.
Are you gonna open the door? Why do you say somebody's not gonna hurt you? People are getting shot by the police.
Oh shit! Damn! Oh shit!
Oh shit.
Can I see your license, please? Get out of the car! Get out of the car! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
I just got my license. You think you're my license? I grabbed my license right there. That's my license right there.
Put your hands behind your back. 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 Put your hands behind your back.
What did I do, sir?
Are you hit?
I think so.
While African Americans are being killed by police officers, some whites are free to take to the social media website Twitter with the hashtag CrimingWhileWhite to reveal instances in which they committed crimes but were never held accountable.
You can have built-in inequities within systems. So one key example has to do with the war on drugs and the way that the war on drugs has been constructed in this country. So the war on drugs began in the mid-1980s, and it came out of Congress's desire to show the American public that they were tough on crime, primarily because media hysteria surrounded this notion of drugs flooding into inner city communities, particularly crack cocaine. And so there was round-the-clock media coverage of the ways in which crack cocaine was supposedly harming communities of color. Now, Congress held very few hearings, really didn't hear from experts, but quickly put harsh, draconian laws in place that impacted the poorest of the poor within our society. One of the things that they decided to do was to make sure that the laws were harsh enough to punish who they felt were the most serious drug offenders. And so when you look at crack cocaine, for example, African Americans were more likely to be associated with trafficking crack cocaine. And rather than punishing the base of crack cocaine more heavily, which is powder cocaine. They actually punished a byproduct more heavily. And whites were more likely to be associated with trafficking powder cocaine. And so at the time, Congress put a 100-to-1 sentencing ratio in place in terms of its treatment of crack versus powder cocaine. So someone caught with roughly a teaspoon of crack cocaine would receive the same 5-year mandatory minimum prison term as someone caught with the size of a loaf of bread of powder cocaine. Now, the reality is that the street value of a crack rock versus the size of a loaf of bread of powder cocaine, there's no real comparison. Powder cocaine is worth significantly more on the streets. And again, I mentioned whites were more likely to be associated with trafficking powder cocaine. So it doesn't make any sense that if you're trying to get a drug off the street, you're trying to send a message that certain drugs won't be tolerated, that you would go after a byproduct of a drug instead of the actual base of the drug. But that's precisely what happened. And so you had low-level drug dealers who were African American and Latino. You have folks who were actually using drugs who wound up spending 5, 10, 15, 20 years or more in prison for very small quantities of crack cocaine. And meanwhile, you would have to be a high-level powder cocaine dealer or a kingpin to serve a similar prison term. That is a built-in inequity within the law that impacted people of color much more heavily than their white counterparts. And people can look at the law and say, hey, Congress, it would, put this law forward and it was neutral on its face. Well, Congress knew that African Americans were more likely to be associated with crack cocaine when they put that law in place. So it may have been written in a neutral way, but it was not applied in a neutral way. It was applied in a manner that disproportionately impacted African Americans.
And there is this sort of recent uptick in sort of compassionate care regarding heroin use, and there is more bit of an epidemic in heroin use amongst suburban white people.
You and I are going on a difficult journey. The statistics alone are alarming. The number of heroin users has nearly doubled in just the past 3 years. Even more surprising may be the face of the new addicts. Tonight, you're going to meet kids from families you never thought could fall victim to drugs. Families who did everything right, and still their kids are hooked.
This is Ashley. She's just 21 years old and smoking as many as 100 hits of heroin a day.
I think when people look at me, they see that I live in a really nice house and that, I don't look like a heroin addict.
Ashley lives in a suburb outside Minneapolis. The idea that heroin addiction is reserved for the inner city is wrong, as you'll see.
Heroin is getting stronger and the users in the Twin Cities getting younger.
When addiction was a black problem, there was no wave of national compassion. Instead, we were warned of super predators, young, faceless black men wearing bandanas and sagging jeans. No matter how far from our lives crack was, we're guilty by association. African Americans were cast as pathological. Their plight was evidence of collective moral failure, of welfare mothers and rock-slinging thugs, and a reason to cut off all help. Blacks would just have to pull themselves out of the crack epidemic. Until then, the only answer lay in cordoning off the wreckage with militarized policing. Today, police chiefs facing heroin addiction are responding not by invoking war, but by trying to save lives and get people into rehab. Suddenly, crime is understood as a sign of underlying addiction, rather than a scourge to be eradicated. One former narcotics officer said, "These are people. They have a purpose in life, and we can't look at it any other way." But he couldn't quite put his finger on just what had changed.
Even though the heroin epidemic is clearly a white problem, some white politicians continue to use thinly veiled, coded language to suggest black drug dealers are the real blame.
Traffickers. These are people that take drugs. These are guys that are named D-Money, Smoothie, Shifty, these type of guys that come from Connecticut, New York. They come up here, they sell their heroin, then they go back home. Incidentally, half the time they impregnate a young white girl before they leave, which is a real sad thing, because then we have another issue that we got to deal with down the road.
How do we end white supremacy?
It's a $1 million question of how we end white supremacy. It's very difficult for us to fight back against a system that really began before the founding of this country. However, I still have hope, even in the midst of all of that, because of the fact that our ancestors were resilient in the face of oppression and discrimination and white supremacy, and they didn't give up. They hoped against hope. And because of their resilience and because of their tenacity and their perseverance, that's why we're here today. That's why we're able to continue to stand and to fight for justice and freedom and equality.
I think it sounds really simple, but I do think there has to be avenues into helping whites understand their lived experience, what that means in relationship to others. I think it's having to explore their own hidden biases, their own assumptions.
We have to actually be conscious and cognizant of the fact that we are living in a land that is filled with symbols of white supremacy, and where white supremacist notions really set the stage for why the things are the way that they are in our society in terms of the inequities that we've talked about before, and the ways in which our systems are structured and our institutions have been built. So once you're conscious and you're cognizant of the fact that white supremacy not only still exists in this country, but continues to perpetuate from one generation to the next, and you have that desire to be free, then it's time to take action.
We have to have a call to action to start dismantling some of the structures that we currently have in place.
And I think one of the most profound things that we can do organizationally is really around diversifying the people that occupy and that work within an institution. I think that there's cultural knowledge, there's cultural experience, there's lived experience that people that occupy different racial groups, different lived experiences can bring to an organization that can help the organization be better. But I find that the examination of policies and practices and the hiring practices are sometimes the hardest things to impact.
So I would argue that it's important for those who deem themselves allies to begin to pay attention, to begin to challenge the privilege that they have, to put that privilege on a shelf, and to work for justice. And that might mean making sacrifices. That might mean losing friends and not being welcome in certain places once you start speaking the truth, once you start challenging the status quo.
We need to study not just white people, but ourselves first. We got to get acquainted with black people, because we're not. Even those who think we know a little bit, you're not. If you, one of the things you learn about studying black history, black people in general, that you don't know much. That's what I learned. You don't know a lot of stuff, man. That's the deal. So when black people say of our children, like, that's because they don't know their history. Well, you don't either. You're 65 years old. You really don't know.
A few ways that we can dismantle structural racism is the first and the most, most easy way to do it is to be honest about the reality and be in dialogue cross-culturally. I think that is paramount, and it seems small, but in all of the years that I've been engaged in change work, I know that, and I truly believe that one of the most profound ways to change hearts and minds is through relationships. So I think that being in relationship cross-culturally, cross-racially is a start. But it's a small start. I think that institutionally, there should be a commitment to setting a standard for the kind of behavior and the kind of comments that are acceptable within any environment. I'm surprised that there's not more institutional commitment to setting standards around expected behavior. You have to set a standard for the type for what you'll accept as an organization as it relates to cross-cultural, cross-racial interactions.
So there needs to be some type of disruption in terms of this overarching system of white supremacy if we're going to change the things that are harming our most vulnerable citizens.
Ultimately, people of color need for middle class and working class whites to stop seeing white skin as a more valuable commodity than building coalitions with non-whites who are also middle class and working class. Until these whites come on board with their non-white counterparts to challenge the policies of this country that benefit the mostly white 1%, racism and white supremacy will remain a permanent fixture in the U.S.
It's most important to just find a way to plug in and to fight back against the status quo. For some people, that might mean becoming more engaged in policy and the ways in which our laws are structured, and maybe even running for office in order to change things. For others, it might mean pushing for economic justice. I argue that in the 60s, when Dr. King started talking about economic justice and having the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., that's when he really became dangerous, because he pushed forward notions that would turn the system of capitalism on its head. He said in November of 1967, we're going to have a Poor People's Campaign. We're going to travel to Washington, D.C. We're going to ask for affordable housing. We're going to ask for universal health care. We're going to ask for a guaranteed minimum income for all Americans and a higher minimum wage. And we're not going to leave Washington, D.C. until we get what we asked for. And he said we're going to do this in April of 1968. Well, guess what? Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th of 1968. And we never saw the fullness of this movement towards economic justice that he and others were fighting for. So that means that there's a lot of unfinished business that needs to be done. We see a lack of economic justice in terms of how our systems are structured, in terms of how corporations are run, in terms of who has access to opportunity and who does not. And so there's a need for us to push for economic justice so that the poor can have equal access to opportunity and a way of becoming upwardly mobile in a land that has unfortunately been hostile to people of color and been hostile to poor people.